I can still remember the first baby that died on my shift in residency. I can see his mother rocking him back and forth in a rocking chair, singing, "Eric Baker, I love you." That was over 30 years ago. And being with parents when a child dies has never gotten easier. Back then, we had no clue what caused a crib death, as they were called back then. That was before the Back to Sleeping campaign. That was before we even knew that smoking increased the chance of crib deaths, or sudden unexplained infant deaths, as they are called now. And that's common knowledge now, but what's not common knowledge is that any sort of air pollution causes damage to fetuses and babies. Dirty air, whether it's smoking cigarettes or forest fires, from burning fuel in power plants, or diesel or car exhaust, even dust, they're all bad for pregnant women and fetuses. So Rob's going to talk to us a bit on the relationship between air pollution and climate change.
So as we go through the presentation today, we have some citations from scientific papers, a graph or two, but let's keep in mind that it's all about this, about people, particularly people in high-risk populations, which includes children and elderly, among many others. But it's also about people just trying to live their lives and do things that they enjoy in the setting of climate change. So we aren't going to spend a lot of time on this, but this slide shows the different impacts of climate change on our health. Across the top, the climate pressures, increased temperatures, rising sea level, of course, is not directly impacting Montanans, but will indirectly impact us. More extreme weather. Then across the middle, things like extreme heat, water contamination, changes in vector ecology, and air pollution, which we are going to focus on a little bit. And then in the bottom, the impacts on individuals. Heat stroke, respiratory and cardiovascular disease, infectious diseases, particularly important and under-recognized mental health issues. And one of our focuses today, adverse birth outcomes and impacts on pregnant women. So let's take a step back though, before we go to climate change, let's talk about air quality, because that's where things start. We talk about air pollution a lot. And yes, air pollution is the cause of climate change, or the primary contributor to it. But saying air pollution is kind of like saying cancer. Depending on how you break it down, there are hundreds or thousands of kinds of cancer. They're all bad. Air pollution is also all bad, but let's look at it a little bit differently. The air pollution that contributes to climate change are primarily the greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is one of the most important just because of the sheer volume of carbon dioxide that we produce. Methane is one, nitrous oxides, fluorinated gases, and a few others. But the main components of air pollution that impact our health are not the greenhouse gases, but particulate matter, ground level ozone, which is different from the ozone that has the holes in it up over the Arctic and Antarctic. And then also included in this allergens as an air pollution or as an air pollutant, because that very much impacts our health. Now, before we go further, I want everybody to take a minute, and I want you to close your eyes, and we're going to take an imaginary journey. We're going to shrink down to the microscopic level, and off to your right is what looks like a piece of grit or a piece of dirt. Other people may see it as maybe even a clear drop of fluid. That is particulate matter, and that particularly is PM 2.5 or 2.5 microns in size. Now, you probably don't want to lean on it because it also has acids and heavy metals and may have some biological contaminants like bacteria or viruses. And I think of it as being prickly. Now, it's about the same size as we are. Off to our left, towering over us, 3 or 4 times our height, is another big thing. In fact, it's a human red blood cell. And that gives us an idea of the size of PM 2.5, which is one of the really bad actors in terms of our health. Now, we're going to blow ourselves back up, back to our regular level, and consider that PM 2.5 and smaller, it's, again, this very biologically active particle is, we breathe it in, it gets into our lungs. Now, bigger particulate matter, such as PM10 or 10 microns across, settles out in the upper airways, and it can get down to the smaller airways, but not as much as the PM 2.5. And if it does, it kind of sits there. But PM 2.5, in addition to causing irritation and inflammation in the airways themselves, actually can get into our bloodstream. Now, think about that. Something we breathe in gets into our bloodstream, a particle. That's bad enough. But these particles have been found within the blood-brain barrier, which nothing should be getting across the blood-brain barrier. And particularly important, what Lori will talk about in a little bit, is on the fetal side of the placenta in a pregnant woman. So that gives you an idea of why it's so bad and how it impacts our health, where it sets up inflammation and contributes to, in both particularly adults, increased heart attacks and strokes. It has impacts on pregnant women and their fetuses, and it has particularly bad impacts on our lungs. Now, going back to air pollution in general, first of all, let's keep in mind that our air quality in the United States is significantly better than it was 2 or 3 decades ago. And that's the result of the Clean Air Act and organizations like the American Lung Association, who have fought so hard to have it enforced. Despite that, their estimates are that today, anywhere from 70 to 250,000 people die in the United States every single year just from air pollution. In addition to that, despite the improvement in the air quality, that's not been enough to slow down climate change. Now, this is just going back to the PM 2.5 and give you an idea of size comparisons if you couldn't imagine it a minute ago. And there's the human red blood cell. Now, one thing that's, again, to emphasize on this particular slide is the PM10 on the right and the 2.5 look inert. They look like they're just pieces of dirt. That's deceiving because they're very biologically active. Now, how about in Montana? What are we concerned about? Well, every year the American Lung Association does a report, the state of the air. And in 2020, in Montana, those places that reported got an A grade when it comes to ozone because we don't produce or have much ozone problem. But for particulate matter, 10 counties got an F, 2 got a D, and 1 got a C. That's particularly significant because there were only 13 counties that reported PM data and only 7 counties that collected ozone data at that time. Now, we're going to pick on Missoula a little bit, but in picking on Missoula, I also want to point out that Missoula is the model that we should all be following in terms of addressing issues and trying to make a difference. But Missoula was ranked in 2020 the 7th worst in the country, in the entire United States, for short-term particulate matter. Spread over the entire year, it was 16th worst. And most of that is from forest fire smoke. You know, in other places, it is more industrial or traffic issues, but for us, it's wildfires. Now, when it comes to issues for climate change in Montana, the primary impacts that we expect to see, 1 is heat, 2 is wildfire. Now, we understand that wildfire is not entirely climate change, or is not solely the result of climate change. Some of it is due to our practices of suppressing fire for the past century in our forests, but at least in one study, about 70% of the attribution of wildfires was due to climate change. But it's worth pointing out that wildfire particulate matter is even worse than industrial particulate matter. There were increases in respiratory hospitalizations from wildfire up to about 10% more than from other sources. And in this slide, LFS, or is landscape fire smoke, is also associated with hospitalizations and emergency department visits, and also with preterm births, is worse with wildfires than with other types of particulate matter. And with that, I will turn it over to Lori.
So even before we conceive, dirty air decreases fertility rates. There's been good research done around vehicle pollution and power plant pollution that shows decreases in fertility that resolve when those issues go away. Fetuses are also exquisitely sensitive to dirty air. Researchers are increasingly discovering the damage done to a fetus when moms breathe dirty air. So when we breathe particulate matter, we're at increased risk of delivering prematurely. And we think about 3% of all preterm births in the US are due to air pollution, about 16,000 a year. Dirty air also increases the risk of delivering a baby with what's called IUGR, or intrauterine growth retardation, which isn't just a baby that's born tiny. It's a baby that's born with potential for increased complications its whole life. Pregnant moms breathing in particulate matter put their infants at increased risk of sudden unexplained infant death. Exposure to air pollution in pregnancy has been linked to decreased lung function for the infant and the child after they're born, increased respiratory symptoms, the development of childhood asthma, high blood pressure, some thyroid problems, and certain heart defects. And air pollution has also been linked in a number of studies to neurodevelopmental problems like learning disabilities, lower IQ, ADHD, and autism. Note, there's a lot of other things that cause those problems, but air pollution looks like it makes it worse. Heat also affects our pregnancies, though, and we're more likely to deliver preterm if we've experienced a heat wave during our pregnancy. We're more likely to deliver a baby that has intrauterine growth retardation. We're not sure yet with smoke if it's the stress of the wildfire or the smoke are both put together that seems to cause the negative impacts. So by the middle of the century, if business continues at normal, those of us in Eastern Montana are going to have over 30 more days a year that are over 90 degrees. And already most of our Eastern Montana counties have a medium high to high, what's called a heat vulnerability index, which looks at not just heat, but people's income, their employment, et cetera. And this affects the amount of food grown. And this affects the economics of the region, which affects our families and our mental health. And of course, economics are affected other places in the state, again, affecting our families with declines in rec tourism from smoke or stressed out fish and those sorts of things. Algae blooms, which we are finding increasingly happening because of warmer waters nowadays, can lead to deaths of animals and humans. But again, also affect economics and affect our own families, and also affect our children in that it decreases their ability to play and exercise, and it erodes a child's confidence in a world that's a safe place. So wildfire smoke leads to alterations in our lives, and preaching to the choir here on this. For our children, less outdoor playtime and activities, limitations on sports, and those things are important. I've heard so many people talking about how difficult it was to have a month of summer and be unable to really enjoy the outdoors. And that has a huge effect on our well-being. And we need to remember that people that are living in substandard housing that are poorly sealed, that the particulate matter they're breathing indoors is sometimes as bad as it is outdoors. So they can't even escape from the bad air. Of course, we're having more wildfires, and they're bigger than they used to be because of climate change. And these prolonged wildfire effects affect our own mental health too, which affect the way we interact with our kids. If we look at the Indigenous people in our state, for our Indigenous youth, the unpredictability of the seasons, the alterations to traditional food gathering that's occurring is just one more thing that's endangering the retention of their culture. So we don't have enough population base to get good statistics in Montana on a lot of things. But in other parts of the country, they've documented significant mental health concerns, depression, anxiety, and PTSD due to wildfire and due to extreme weather events. And many studies show that kids are affected more than adults, and that sometimes it can last for years or decades. Most of us know someone, maybe even ourselves, whose mental health suffered during a fire season. It's encouraging to see that both Healthy Gallatin and Climate Smart Missoula websites note a concern for mental health after wildfires. Also affecting mental health is heat. And increased heat increases all forms of violence, including altercations, domestic violence, child abuse, and suicides. But drought affects the tough guys too. So research was just published last year after a survey done with Montana farmers and ranchers, and nearly 3/4 of the farmers and ranchers in Montana believed that climate change was having a bad effect on their operation, and they reported feeling moderate to high anxiety for their farm operations because of climate conditions. And then we have the whole idea of eco-anxiety. And certainly our kids are developing that as well as a lot of their grown-ups. So sorry to present so much sadness, but we all need to be aware so that we can work towards change. The kind of changes like Winona leads a lot of us in doing. And so we're going to talk just really briefly about things we can do, and then Winona's going to go into specific actions that she's working on. First of all, if the air is orange outside, we should be wearing N95s. And if the air is orange outside, we shouldn't be doing vigorous activity with our kids, because up to age 18, as best we know now, they're all in the vulnerable population. And so when we're planning things, we need to have an alternate insight, because we know how hard it is on kids when you've planned to go on this great camping trip and now you can't go. So have an alternate plan for inside. I don't know about you, but I still like sleeping in a tent in the living room. Bring nature indoors and plan on having arts and crafts. Do crazy Olympic sport games. Just be ready for a vacation that might not happen when it's during the risk of wildfire smoke season. So take your kids to protests with you, and I know a lot of you are doing that. Take them to the members of Congress's offices. Encourage your older kids, like your teens, to develop skills that are going to help them in protests. So speech and debate is a great way for young adults to develop skills and to educate other people on climate issues. Join a club, and that might be a virtual club. We know from living in Eastern Montana and homeschooling our kids that there weren't a lot of similarly passionate people around us. So there's groups online like Winona's group, and like the Roots and Shoots from Jane Goodall. But you can also look at the clubs people are already in, the kids are in 4-H and Girl Scouts, and they can do things related to climate change in those organizations also. Our quieter kids might be writers, and writing to members of Congress, writing in writing contests, doing a news column in a local newspaper are all things that our writers can do. And people really watch and listen to the kids that do this. Our daughter wrote an environmental column for 6 years, and we're just known in Hardin as the parents of Elizabeth Byron, because everybody knew her in her column. Kids can do fundraising, and they can be more effective at it than we are. So they can help them find a cause that they really care about. And I think as parents, while it's important to be optimistic, there's also a recognition that this is tough. It's tough on our kids, it's tough on us, and it hits kids at different ages and at different times. So be open to the possibility of needing mental health services too. So if you or anybody in your family are in any way touching health with your vocation or your avocation, we'd love to have you sign on with us. Just like with Winona's group, it's we get power from having more people behind us as we fight this cause together. So we'll hand it back over to Winona.
Great, thank you. I just have a few more things to add. That was just really powerful and impactful. I think getting involved is the key for parents to feel better about what's happening, and also kids who are aware of kind of what we're facing and what the scope of the problem we need to address. I think Montana has numerous organizations to engage with on the state level, or at the local level. Like in whatever community you live in, there's probably an organization that you could join and get involved with. We're often asked what gives us hope. And my simple response is always action is our hope. Action and getting involved. And the truth is, even though it might seem like bringing up climate change is going to be a divisive topic or conversation, according to Yale's climate map data, 72% of Montanans know it's happening and are aware of it. And if you bring it up in the context of something you care about that the other person shares, there's a pretty good chance you're going to have a positive conversation, especially if you focus on just trying to have another conversation and not trying to win an argument. That's a really great place to start, is talking about it more. And that's something we can all do every day, is talk about it more, why we're worried about it, what solutions are out there, and why it's important for us to be involved. We put together a handy dandy guide to getting involved with the climate movement in Montana. Depending on the amount of time you have, many families feel like they have zero time, and that's a true thing. If you're working more than one job, even if you're working one job and have multiple kids, it's really hard to find time for extra activities. So this guide goes from zero time to having a couple hours a week to get involved. And there's also a link to taking climate action with kids, which anything from helping them bake a batch of cookies and doing a bake sale in your local park to raise money for climate, or one of the critters that we're trying to save in Montana. My daughter did that, and it was really empowering, and it was a whole Saturday morning activity for her, and she felt great afterward and felt really engaged and seen by her community. Another one of the kids involved with our group did a whole series of sidewalk art pieces with calls to action, questions, and she got questions from her neighbors. Her whole community right around her home saw that, and it was very empowering for her. So those are just a few ideas. And I know Moms Clean Air Force Montana always has, is our direct connection to action at the federal level for clean air and climate for families. And we look to them often for really amazing actions to engage with, from signing petitions or giving testimony. And Michelle might want to speak to that more. Do you want to add anything, Michelle, for getting involved?
I love the recognition that I like to think about where we're not running it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And so we all need to think about how we can work together. What are the things that we can do that fit with our lives, that help move us forward as a community. And so Moms Clean Air Force right now, we're spending a lot of time focusing on Build Back Better, the Build Back Better bill, and getting that passed in DC. And, I think an encouraging thing to say is that there are families, parents, youth, caregivers all over the country working together to push for that. So that's a big thing we're focused on right now. And we hear constantly from decision makers that, they need to hear from us. So I think that's just important to remind folks that picking up the phone and calling Senator Tester, Senator Daines, and even Matt Rosendale, Congressman Rosendale, those are all really important actions that we can take. And I think that what might feel like smaller individual acts, I want to say how important those are, like the chalk art, Winona, or encouraging your children to write letters to the editor. And then I think we can really amplify that through social media these days. So, that these very visual displays of youth voices and youth passion for their home matter so much. So coloring a picture at home and posting it on social media and tagging your senator, tagging any elected representative and saying, my family is concerned, we need your help. So we have this tool, social media, that anybody can use to reach decision makers. And I always lean back on coloring, engaging my kids. It's really important. So, and I'm really grateful, Rob and Lori, for your sharing the presentation today. So I want to say thank you. The other thing that we hear regularly from decision makers and Senator Tester in particular is we really need to continue talking about how this impacts us and why it matters, and telling our stories. And it's heartbreaking to learn about how air pollution impacts our most vulnerable community members, our babies. But if we aren't talking about that, then the urgency isn't there. So thank you for sharing that story today. One other thing that Moms is working on at the federal level, in addition to Build Back Better, is the Black maternal health bill. And it's a bill focusing on climate change and how do we increase Black maternal health rates. And that's another priority for us as well.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us and sharing those actions. We love Moms Clean Air Force and loving partnering with you. And thank you for supporting this event today and being here. I have one more thing to share. We're part of an international network called Our Kids Climate, and we also work with Parents for Future Global. I'm actually a fellow with their Climate Parent Fellowship this year. And one of the things we're working on are collecting stories from Montanans who have been impacted by air pollution in advance of COP26 in a few weeks. We'll also be signing on to a parent and caregiver organization letter, which will be delivered, it sounds like, directly to Alok Sharma, who's the president of COP26 and the delegate. So we're pushing for that. So if you have stories, you can connect with us through this project called Montana Climate Stories. I'm going to drop that into the chat. And it is a collaboration between Families for a Livable Climate, Stories for Action, and newly Montana Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate. So we'll be collecting stories about any climate impact for that site. And if you specifically have stories regarding air pollution, we'll share those with the COP26 project as well. So I'm going to end. I want to thank Rob and Lori Byron. I'm going to end the recording now so we can take questions and just open it up. You can ask questions in the chat or just speak up. We have a small group and it would be nice to hear from everyone. Oops. I almost ended the meeting. That's not what I want to do. Stop.